And welcome and thank you for joining me today. I am Dr. Emilia Ripoll. I am a urologist, urological oncologist, acupuncturist, and I have been practicing integrative medicine for the last 25 years. The topic of today's webinar is how to engage, strengthen, and educate the immune system to become the key to surviving not only this pandemic of COVID-19, but future ones to come. I want to take this opportunity to discuss with you some of the strategies that are readily available and which you can incorporate easily into your practices in the ongoing fight against viral infections. For the longest time, our biggest challenges were bacterial infections. Thanks to the discovery and usage of antibiotics, the old bacterial pandemics have been replaced by viral ones. So let's take a look at pandemics from a historical perspective, which may help us identify interesting patterns. The first well-documented pandemic, and the biggest and most devastating one, was the Black Plague, also known as bubonic plague and the Black Death. It affected the entire world population, and it went on for many years, approximately 7 years, from 1346 to 1353. The spread was due to trading, and it followed both sea and land routes. Now, thanks to planes, the spreads are faster. It killed about 50% of the population across the world. It is estimated that 85 million people perished in the 7-year period. It did not discriminate between races, country, age, and gender. What you see here are called buboes, which are enlarged suppurative lymph nodes, and where the name of bubonic plague originated. Mass graves had to be used in order to keep up with the death and devastation. In some cases, entire small villages were eradicated by the plague. After the Black Death, we have experienced other significant waves of diseases such as typhoid fever, typhus, etc. Interestingly, many of these pandemics are now endemic in some areas of the world and continue to affect people. Let us use cholera as an example. Descriptions of cholera are found as early as the 5th century before Christ and even in Sanskrit. Cholera affects an estimated anywhere from 3 to 5 million people worldwide per year and claims between 30,000 and 130,000 deaths a year. There has been about 7 large outbreaks of cholera over the last 200 years. That's on top of what we've already mentioned, the low-level one. The risk of death among those affected is anywhere from 5% to 50%. It all depends if you have access to medical care or not. And of course, children, due to their size and to their ability of becoming very dehydrated very quickly, are the most vulnerable. The study of cholera in England was carried out by John Snow, who was the father of epidemiology. This was between 1849 and 1854. And by the way, he has nothing to do with the guy in the Game of Thrones. We had this big discussion with my daughter. John Snow, as you know, was like I was mentioning, the father of epidemiology. He was best known for his discovery of lysozymes. And so he was Scottish descent, and he was first recognized for the discovery, like I said, of lysozymes. He did that in 1923. And then he discovered penicillin G, and then he was given the Nobel Prize in Physiology in 1945 for that. And he was actually knighted for his scientific achievements in 1944. He's only one of 3 Scots to ever be knighted. What you see here right now is the Penicillium notatum, and which is where penicillin comes from. Now, what we have is that after we were able to conquer bacterial infections due to, at least in the developing countries, and due to the antibiotics, although now we have to be worried about the bacterial resistances that are currently developing, viral infection and pandemics have become more prevalent and more difficult to treat. Let us talk about the Spanish flu, which is probably one of the best known pandemics in the 20th century. The Spanish flu, unlike popular belief and a bone of contention between me and my husband, did not originate in Spain. It actually originated in Asia. But because Spain was one of the countries that was in Europe that did not participate in World War I, they were the first ones to report it, while the people that were the countries that had people fighting did not have the opportunity to do so. It infected 500 million people, about 50 to 100 million people died. The mortality rate has been quoted anywhere from 10 to 20%. And I think the biggest difference between that pandemic and the one of COVID-19 is that the people most affected have been younger adults. I really believe that that was due to the fact that these were the poor guys that were in the trenches, starving to death, poor sanitation, and you can imagine in the worst stress that anybody could ever have. So no wonder that they were the ones that were the most susceptible. So one thing that we saw with Spanish flu that we learned was that it actually had two peaks, and that's one of the things that we're concerned about that we may see as well with COVID-19. There were temporary civilian medical wars that had to be started all over America because we couldn't keep up with regular hospitals, and these were civilian. And then we had U.S. Army medical wards in World War I for Spanish flu. These kids were not injured by bullets. They were actually injured by the viruses themselves. So what came after the Spanish flu is a series of influenza pandemics. Okay, and as cholera, cases have been described all the way back to 1200 BC, and even in the Sanskrit language. So these pandemic influenza-type infections have been around for a long time. As you can see, the case fatality rate is important, but so is the number of deaths they have claimed worldwide, which partly is due to how each of these viruses is able to reproduce, and that's called reproductive ratios. A good way to understand, for example, the reproductive ratio is with this diagram. So what is the reproductive ratio? It's the average number of people infected from another person. For example, Ebola has a reproductive ratio of 2. So one person with Ebola will pass it on to 2 other people. In the case of SARS, the reproductive ratio is 4, which means one person can infect 4 others. In the case of COVID, it has been mentioned that it's 5, some people have even said 6, and on, remembering that this becomes very quickly exponential. For example, one Ebola can infect 4 after 1 generation, but one COVID can infect 25 people after 1 generation. So even though Ebola has a higher mortality rate, the reason why COVID is so much more dangerous is because it can spread a lot quicker and faster. This is another slide that just gives you an idea of some of the reproductive ratios of some of the other viral infections. And it's kind of interesting how if you look at the poxes, like measles, chickenpox, all of these ones here, smallpox, their RO is pretty high. Look at them. Some of them had anywhere from 12 to 18. You can imagine after 1 generation, that's hundreds of people. So no wonder it had such devastating effects like smallpox in America, for example. And then we have already talked about COVID being 5.7. MERS didn't have as big of a reproductive, but it had significant mortality. So where are we today? So today, literally today, the cases in America are 1,369,000, and we have 82,387 dead people. That's pretty significant. We are definitely number 1 in the number of cases, as we just mentioned, 70,000. Russia's number 2, but they're peaking. They're in a couple of weeks or 3 weeks. We're going to see those numbers being a lot more significant. They also have a lot more areas that are not as heavily populated as our own. Spain is number 3 with 228,000. The UK is coming up. They have almost the same number of cases as Spain. Italy is number 5. Okay, and then if we look at the mortality, we see that the United States right now is unfortunately number one, 82,000 people approximately. The UK is number two, Italy number three, Spain is number four, France is coming back up. And what we're seeing here is that, of course, not everybody's peaking at one time. But what's interesting is Germany, for example, who have had significant number of cases, but their mortality rate has been extremely low. So their medical care appears to be very strong and capable. This to show you the mortality rate, how different it can be from different countries. Spain has a mortality rate of almost 12%. Italy was closer to 14%. UK is 15%. If you look at France right now, 19% mortality rate. Belgium, 16%. Holland, 13%, Sweden, almost 13%. So how about the United States? So we're up to almost 6%. And I think that's good. I think that shows that we have a strong system and that we have good hospitals and very well-trained physicians that are making a big difference. Why did we seclude people in Spain? I'm in Spain right now, like I told you earlier, we're in our 9th week right now of seclusion. And the reason why we had to do that is because just because we have a pandemic doesn't mean we don't have people with heart disease and heart attacks and motor vehicle accidents. I mean, those ICU beds are there for those people as well. That doesn't stop happening. So we had to spread how the cases were presenting, because otherwise we would have overwhelmed our system and our mortality rate would have been even higher. We've had, actually today we're going to have silence for all the nurses and physicians and healthcare providers that have perished in the front lines. And so we're going to have 2 minutes where we're going to honor them, which is kind of tragic. And so, and this is just a little summary that I wanted to show you of pandemics that have happened since the Spanish flu. I mean, look at these. And these are only respiratory ones, by the way. These don't even have Ebola, all the AIDS, etc., etc. But even if we just look at the respiratory ones, well, the first one was 1918. The next one was the Asian flu, and it was 40 years later. Then we have type A influenza, and that was like 10 years later. Then SARS came around. And if you notice here, not only are the severity of these viruses becoming very significant with very high mortality rate. I mean, look at SARS had what, a mortality rate of 35%. Okay, MERS 10%. COVID mortality, I just showed you, varies quite a bit depending on what country you're in. But it's only been 4 years since MERS came around, okay? So what we're seeing is that we're not able to stop these viral infections, and they're coming more and more frequently. So what can we do to prepare? What do we have, by the way? So I wanted to discuss with you this paper that has been put out by JAMA in just a month ago, by the way, which was well done. And this was a review. And what they were trying to do is they were looking at every pharmacological treatment that was available, not only for COVID, for SARS and MERS, and what have we learned in general from other viral infections, and how can we use those antivirals. And what they found is that after looking at doing a literature review and looking at all of the infections that I just mentioned, they found about 1,315 total articles. And they looked at every antiviral agent that was, helpful for preventing viral cell entry. Other antiviral agents that would cause blocking of the membrane fusion so they couldn't penetrate into the cell. Prevention of encoding, how to block the uncoding. Viral replication, how to stop viral replication, viral assembly, inhibiting structural proteins that help the virus come back together, and blocking exocytosis, how to keep it from coming into the cell in large numbers. Well, guess what? What they concluded of this article was that no therapies have been shown to be effective today. Okay, these are a bunch of, I could show you all of the articles that they reviewed, but I think that's beyond the scope of this talk. But I think the most important thing is this conclusion: no therapies have been shown to be effective today. And that was a month ago. Okay, what they did say is that that the most effective long-term strategy that they could think of was prevention of future outbreaks via the development of vaccines, which would take anywhere from 12 to 18 months. Well, the thing that they failed to mention is that there have already been at least 9 or 12 mutations. They're losing count of how many mutations to the original virus has already occurred. So what? It's going to happen the same thing that happens with the influenza every year, that has become now yearly. We create a vaccine and then we realize that it doesn't cover all of them, so people end up continuing to be sick. So the truth of the matter is we cannot depend just on vaccines. We truly have to depend on our own natural immunity, on our own ability of having an immune system that can face the virus and build a natural attack against it. And also, the one thing that the paper I thought was interesting that I found very helpful, primarily since we're talking today about which ways we could interfere with the virus, is the fact that if you can block interleukin 6, if you can use the antagonist, and you can block the cytokine storm that is one of the major complications for these cases that causes the most damage, that we could maybe have some beneficial effects against it. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about with which herbs and which mushrooms can do that in the future. The thing that they did agree on is that corticosteroids was a bit controversial and that they had to be used with great caution and in very specific cases because of the effects they have in the immune system suppression. So where do we go from here? Okay. Well, I think that we realize the tremendous impact this pandemic has had in our lives as individuals, as a society, in our practices, in our government, and we recognize that even after we control this threat, there will be other ones to come. And we can choose to live as we have been and learn, or we can learn from it, okay? Like Korea has. So Korea was significantly devastated economically and medically during the SARS and during the MERS. And so they were already prepared. They had already educated their people. They already had implemented norms in society that would help. And honestly, they've only had 250 deaths, which is pretty impressive. Okay, and the number of cases reported in Korea have been only 11,000 as of today. So I think they are somebody that we could mimic, and I think we could learn from them and start learning what to do in the future. And then, who is affected? I mean, we like to think that the only people affected are the older people. We like to say that only people that have chronic diseases like hypertension, heart disease, diabetes, COPD, asthma, people with cancer. The truth is it affects everyone, whether it does it directly or indirectly. All we have to do is go back and think about our lives over the past 2 months. And what do we see? We see how it's changed all of us, our children, etc. So we have a choice. We can go back to sleep and status quo, or we can take this opportunity, learn to implement some newer modalities in our practice, be able to offer that to our patients and to ourselves, and create a new paradigm. So what is the common denominator? Of course, is the immune system. And what can be done? I mean, I think that we all know this. All of us have been doing integrative medicine. We're all thinkers. That's why we do what we do. And we know that if we know that something thrives in a certain environment, but doesn't in another, the first thing that we think of, okay, well, how can we change the environment in a way that this pathogen cannot thrive? So, for example, pH. We know that these viruses don't like alkaline pH, so let's alkalinize our body. We know that oxygenation is an issue, so let's work on that. Detoxification, reduce the toxic load, etc. We know that if we can educate and strengthen the immune system, and that's where mushroom and herbal medicine can be significant, if we can keep the Th1 pathway and the Th2 able to work well and shift from one to the other, not get stuck in one or the other, not to cause inflammation like with excessive amounts of interleukin-6, if we can improve our number of natural killer cells, if we can improve our production of antibodies and recognition, all of that is going to be extremely significant. And also biological age. I mean, whether we like it or not, there's people out there that are 70 years old that are in better health than all of us put together. They run, they eat well, they do all the right things. So biologically, these people are at age of 40 or 50. Of course, that is going to be extremely important. So how do we use regenerative medicine? How do we use lifestyle modifications, etc., which we're all good at? How do we use that in our practice to prevent these from happening? We also know that the opposite is also true. There's a lot of old, younger people that have immune systems that are on the ground because they're overworking. They're in a constant sympathetic overtone. So how do we change that? Okay, how do we rejuvenate and reverse organ damage? For example, people that already have hypertension, heart disease, pulmonary issues. There's a lot of things that can be done with herbs, with acupuncture, with regenerative medicine, and this is our challenge, and I know we can do it because we have been doing it. We just need to up it. We need to do it more significantly. So what am I proposing? I am proposing to implement antiviral protocols into our practice. And what I'm going to do is I've had a lot of experience with this, not only in Spain right now during the COVID. I've been part of a task force with other physicians, and we've put together a program to teach other physicians how to manage this from a integrative perspective. But I would like to present 4 different seminars, one a month, and there will be about 2-hour sessions to educate you on antiviral protocols. We're going to talk about Th1, Th2. We're going to talk about interleukins, how the immune system can cause inflammation, how it can, be, if we understand what goes wrong with the immune system, then we can understand also how to fix it. We're going to use a lot of Chinese medicine. We're going to talk about herbs that can be helpful. That have helped the Chinese. They have a very low mortality rate. Why? Because they have been able to combine Western medicine with old traditional medicine. They have herbs that are good before for prevention, during the disease, and after to make sure there are not sequelae. There's a lot of people now that are having intense neurological issues from surviving COVID. So how do we prevent? We don't want people to survive the virus, but to end up severely affected by it chronically. And so how do we use Chinese medicine, not just herbs, but acupuncture? We're also going to learn how to change the terrain to make it antiviral, so the virus cannot replicate, how to make it unfriendly to the viral life cycle. And we're going to talk a lot about the use of natural antivirals, such as mushrooms. They're amazing, and certain herbs as well. So we're going to learn all about that. And then regenerative medicine. A lot of you are already doing regenerative medicine, so why not look at it with an added benefit of as an antiviral weapon? How do we implement it? We've already talked about that. The first session is going to be all about Chinese herbal formulas to prevent and treat viral infections, and before, during, and after, and more important, how to keep from developing neurological and skin changes that have occurred to the people that are surviving, and also how to use neurotherapy and electric stimulation, and you can even teach some of that to your nurses, who can be important allies during these times, and against viral protocols. A lot of you are not acupuncturists. I'm not expecting you to be, but I think there is certain, you already use neurotherapy. Why not learn a few protocols that can help you in this matter? The second session, which is going to be wonderful, is my favorite, one of my favorites. In reality, all of them are my favorites, but we're going to discuss a little bit about the immune system, Th1, Th2, how to control them, how one interacts with the other, and how we can modulate these with mushrooms, This is going to be super important. Like I said, not only are you going to learn how to balance the two, it's going to help you with people that have autoimmune disorders, people that have cancer as well, and a lot of inflammation. So this is going to be very transcendent. And then we are going to talk on session number 3, ozone, how to do it in your practice safely where you don't get into trouble with the powers, the higher powers, and how we can treat these viral infections, how can we change the terrain, the pH, and other little methodologies that I will provide for you in blocking viral replication. And lastly, we're going to use already things that we already know, PRP, hormones, exosomes, in reversing biological aging and organ rejuvenation. If we strengthen, for example, the lungs, which are one of the key factors, is going to be less likely to succumb to these respiratory infections, etc. So this is going to be an incredible exploration. I'm not going to tell you that some of the things you don't already know. I like to say that you probably already know, but you may have not seen them with a new glasses of using it in your practice against these pandemics. But I do think that you're going to learn a lot of new things, and it's going to give you a sense of empowerment for yourself and for your patients. So join us for this 4-session exploration of the immune system, and all these medical techniques we've already discussed. And if you're interested, please contact Specialty Medical Training. This is their phone number. I think you already know about him anyway. And I'm looking forward to sharing with you 30 years of medical practice, and can't wait to be a part of your new discoveries. Thank you very much for staying with me today.